When I was 9 months old, my parents and I came to the U.S. from Peru. However, we were fortunate enough that we could go back home and visit our family every once in a while. During these visits, I quickly began to notice the differences between the U.S. and Peru. For instance, in Lima, my hometown in Peru, I noticed how I would go to sleep and expect there to be a clear sky with stars. And yet instead, there was a red and groggy sky. And when I went to take a breath of oxygen, there was a smell of pollution brought on mostly by vehicular and industrial emissions. While the U.S. has done better in preventing air pollution, it also has its own challenges. For instance, here in Ohio, we have increasing toxic algal blooms in Lake Erie and hotter temperatures every year. It wasn't clear to me, though, how quickly I needed to act on the climate crisis until 3 years ago when I heard the report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change stating that in order to keep the rise in global temperatures from reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius, we would have to cut carbon emissions by 45% by 2030. That was 3 years ago. And just recently, a study from the Nature Climate Change Journal found that there's already enough carbon pollution in the atmosphere to rise global temperatures of 2.3 degrees Celsius. So we passed that measure by a lot. Of course, climate change isn't the only issue I'm dealing with. Like many of you, I'm not a single issue person. As an immigrant and a Latina, I'm also passionate about immigrant rights, gender equity, and racial justice. The good thing is that the climate justice movement isn't a single issue movement, or at least it shouldn't be. For the past year, I've been a part of the Sunrise Movement, which is a youth-led national movement with a hub here in Columbus dedicated to stopping the climate crisis and creating millions of good jobs in the process. And with them, I've learned that the climate justice movement culminates other social justice movements. Of course, the intersection of these movements isn't a new idea and has been thought of before by leaders in other social justice movements as well, such as Kimberly Crenshaw, who thought of the term intersectionality, or Hazel M. Johnson, who is considered the mother of environmental justice. Take a minute with me and imagine a needle and a thread, and how a needle stitches together different pieces of thread to create a product. In that same way, the climate justice movement is the needle that stitches together other social justice movements to create our product, true climate justice. One of these movements, or stitches, we can see going into our product, climate justice, is immigrant rights. Throughout the history of the United States, we've seen many waves of immigrants, each coming here with their own reasons and challenges. However, a consistent pattern has been that immigrants of color have faced great hardships in acclimating to life here. Just in this past administration, we've seen how immigrants of color have been demonized in the media and their pathways to citizenship have been made harder. And when they get here, they face possible hardships of language barriers, lack of transportation, housing and economic insecurity, and much more. And as the climate crisis magnifies, those issues will only get more harder to achieve. As more and more climate-related disasters happen in different parts of the world, there will be more and more climate refugees. It's estimated that there could be up to 1 billion refugees by 2050 if no climate action is taken. And when those refugees seek refuge and comfort in other countries, it'll only be harder for them to find that. Another stitch or movement is gender equity. The fight for gender equity has gone on for centuries as consistently as the challenges and injustices that have been faced by all those who experience misogyny and gender inequity. From the way society is constructed, to the lack of representation in positions of power, to the burden that will be placed on all those who experience misogyny as the climate crisis unravels. The World Economic Forum found that women and children are 14 times more likely to die or be harmed when disasters strike. And among those displaced by climate change, 80% are women. And while this statistic singles out women, this reality really applies to all those who experience misogyny and gender inequity, which includes trans women, trans people, LGBTQ+ individuals, non-binary and gender non-conforming folks, and anyone who's been left out by the heteropatriarchy because they are less supported in our society. A third stitch or movement is racial justice. While the civil rights movement is considered to be a movement of the past, the continued criminalization and unjust murder of people of color, especially within this past year, has made it clear that the fight is far from over. The way society is constructed is racially biased, and so is the way that the climate crisis will affect different people. Just looking at it globally, the wealthier and typically whiter countries have contributed to the most environmental damage, and yet it's the developing countries and those that consist of more people of color that are going to be affected the most. Thinking about my home Peru, Peru contributes to 0.21 of the global greenhouse gas emissions, and yet we can see that reality there is and will be much different than that of the US, which contributes to 13% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. And that remains the same for all the places that are considered the most affected places and areas by the climate crisis. Looking more closely at the US, the predominantly white and wealthier neighborhoods are going to be better equipped to handle the climate crisis than those that are predominantly people of color and low income. An estimated 70% of contaminated waste sites are located within low-income neighborhoods, and anyone living within a mile of those sites is susceptible to flooding, most of which are Black and brown neighborhoods. Of course, you can't talk about the climate crisis without talking about indigenous peoples, as they have been fighting for and protecting our Earth for numerous generations. While the indigenous sovereignty movement has many goals, from respecting indigenous rights, food sovereignty, criticizing land-grant universities like our own, as they have contributed to large parts of land theft, a continuous theme has been dismantling white supremacy and capitalism, which is going to be instrumental in mitigating the impacts of the climate crisis. The Red Nation, which is a group of Native and non-Native educators, leaders, thinkers, and more, talked about how the reason they came together was because they noticed the invisibility of Native leaders and life within social justice organizing, and foresaw the targeted destruction of Native life and land. So knowing that the climate crisis will affect people disproportionately and will greatly impact Black, Indigenous, and people of color, immigrants, and refugees, all those who experience misogyny, and really anyone who's been left out of society, true climate justice has to not only tackle the climate crisis, but the roots of other social justice injustices as well, while centering the voices of all those who would be the most impacted by the climate crisis. So what does that look like, or how do we get there? Well, a starting point is the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal is a congressional resolution to mobilize every aspect of American society to reach 100% clean and renewable energy, create living wage jobs for anyone who needs one, and a just transition for workers and frontline communities alike, all in the next 10 years, which, given the recent climate update, it's clear that this decade has to be the decade of the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal would provide economic security, clean air and water, affordable and healthy food, housing security, and much more, which makes it a win for everyone. And it's a resolution, so it opens up the possibilities for further just climate legislation to pass as well, which could be the Red New Deal. The Red New Deal was created by the previously mentioned Red Nation to support the Green New Deal and center Native leaders and the knowledge that has come from fighting back against the government that sought to destroy them. Among many demands, the Red New Deal calls for defunding the police, ICE, and abolishing incarceration, as well as ending U.S. military occupation everywhere. And so by piecing together these different pieces of just climate legislation, we eventually get true climate justice, which is a win for every social justice movement, because it means moving towards a world without racial injustices, the heteropatriarchy, and capitalism. It means a world where everyone has guaranteed economic security, well-being, and a livable future for all. With implementations like these in mind, I think back to my home Peru, where people would be able to go to sleep and see the stars at night, and breathe fresh air, and really rest knowing that there's a better future tomorrow. So think about what climate justice achieved could mean for you, and more importantly, How do you plan on fighting for it? Like I mentioned earlier, the intersections of these movements isn't a new idea and has been thought of by leaders in other social justice movements before. It is only when we know how to create the stitch that we can start contributing to the greater thread that brings us all together. Thank you.